That's a good one.
All right, so today's conversation is all about understanding and overcoming guilt so that we can improve overall well-being and quality of life. It's all about getting clear on whether your guilt is justified, because sometimes guilt is very irrational. And if it is justified, what to do next, and regain control over our emotions and actions. That's going to be the purpose of today's conversation. Guilt is an emotion that emerges from feeling responsible for a real or perceived wrongdoing. And that's a big point, because with discernment, we can evaluate whether the guilt is even appropriate or not. You know, in many cases, it's not appropriate, and people are struggling with it, and it's draining them and blocking their joyful experience of life. So guilt can bring remorse, self-blame, regret. But there's also an action call with guilt. It's a call to action to self-correct and grow. But too much of it can really bring us down. We don't want to let it creep in and immobilize us from fulfilling our life purpose. So first thing we're going to do is discuss the common misconceptions about guilt. Common misconceptions about guilt. Does anyone have any thoughts on what any of those misconceptions might be? Because there's five big ones. 5 big ones with guilt, at least.
Yep. Sometimes guilt can be based on old, inaccurate paradigms, beliefs, or patterns.
Yes.
You're taking things from the past and applying them to the current situation and feeling guilty. But really, what you were seeing in the past was something inaccurate. And it'll make you behave in the current situation as you did in the past, which may not be the most mature way when you're being motivated by guilt based on an old pattern or old belief.
Correct. So you nailed it. One misconception is that guilt always indicates wrongdoing, and that's not necessarily true. We can be taking stuff from the past, applying it to the present. Our guilt can be irrational. It can be based on unfounded beliefs or unrealistic expectations. You know, sometimes people feel guilty for things that are beyond their control, right? Like a big thing is like survivor's guilt. Like if you're in the military and the other people in your troop got killed by the enemy and you didn't, now you got survivor's guilt. It's like, that's completely inappropriate. Why should you didn't kill them? Like you just happened to survive. Right? So that can be an example of something, or they feel guilty for an event in which they played no role. It's like, well, I used to date this person, and then after we broke up, you know, they got really into a dark place. A couple of years later, they got into drinking, and a few years later, they killed themselves. Right? And I feel guilty, and it's like, you didn't necessarily play the direct role you think in that, because they did their actions out of their own free will. So it's like that guilt is, you know, once again, a little bit doesn't indicate wrongdoing, you know. So anyway, that's definitely one of them.
I always felt guilty about what happened with Marge after she left the house. That I couldn't take care of her and I couldn't support her or provide for her. And that's a guilt that I've been carrying along with myself for quite a long time. I'm starting to finally come to terms with it. But I can understand what you're saying about caring about that type of guilt.
Yes. And what we're doing is sometimes that kind of guilt needs a little bit of a correction because it's inappropriate. And that's part of why we have this conversation, because we don't want people to be unfairly getting themselves down.
So I would think maybe one of those, Brendan, I don't really know how to properly word this, but maybe a misconception is that we don't have as much power as we think we could have to have stopped something, right? Because as you pointed out, free will, right? Oh, if I had only done this one thing, right, this wouldn't have happened. Because we just saw this here personally about 5 weeks ago. my oldest son's best friend took his life, and he was in our house 2 days before, and there was no indication. And his, several people had an interaction with him 48 hours before it happened.
Yeah.
His dad, literally minutes before it happened, and his dad went back to work. And so everybody was second guessing, well, what if I had done this? What if I had done that? Right. And we don't necessarily have the power or the control that we think that we do to maybe prevent something, right? Because after the dust kind of settled, this young man's dad would, told me he was going to do what he was going to do. Like, we couldn't have stopped it, right?
Yeah.
You can't watch someone 24 hours a day. You can't lock them up. I mean, you can get institutionalized, whatever, but people are going to do what they're going to do, right? Good, bad, whatever. And so I think sometimes we beat ourselves up because we think that we did not exercise power or control that we think would have been more instrumental than maybe it would have. And there's no way of knowing it.
I was going to say the same thing, Steve, but the word that was coming to mind for me was ego.
There you
It's
go.
kind of
Yeah, I
like
would
we
buy
have
that.
this ego that we could have fixed it if we had been more involved, if we had done this. It's also kind of taking responsibility for things outside of ourselves.
Right.
There's a term for this. It's called the Messiah complex. And it's when we assume that we need to be the savior for people that just aren't our assignment.
Right.
Right. And so we take that on and we feel guilty. And it's like you said, like, you can't watch them 24 hours a day. They're going to do what they're going to do. The best way to influence any human being isn't through any of these intercessions so much as it is through the example that you live.
Yeah. Kindness, right? I mean, like,
Yeah.
the example, right? Like, just being pleasant, saying hello, smiling, looking people in the eye when you pass them, that holding the door, just little things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think it's very much, it's something that is natural though, but it's not justified though, right? It's natural to feel that. It's natural for people to have survivor's guilt, even though, like you're saying, there was nothing, unless you were the police officer that ran away or whatever. If you were the law enforcement officer that didn't do your job and, whatever. But most of the time, that is not the case with us just in our day to day. And I like your point of, to a certain extent, we should be looking out for all the people we come in contact, but we cannot possibly expend all the time and energy to blanket everybody and keep everyone's head above water at all times. Like, that's just not possible. You can't do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have to be practical in our idealism. Right. And that's where we can get caught with this Messiah complex, where we feel like we need to do that and we feel like we personally failed. I was supposed to be that person's savior. I was supposed to say something so profound in that last meeting that they wouldn't go out and do what they did.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, we shouldn't put that much pressure on ourselves, even the Messiah himself, if not everyone listened to.
Right.
Right. So, so that's definitely one. I think another thing too is that I'm going to add is that a common misconception is that guilt is always a bad thing. Not necessarily so. It can actually be a positive force for personal growth and moral development. It shows that we're at least in tune with our behavior and the impact it has. It can motivate us to make amends and prevent harmful behaviors when it's justified, right? But it can also bring our attention to things of importance. It can bring our attention to the importance of mental health, right? Like, as a society, how good are we on the mental health front? How good is the school system? You know, or the stuff that's out there in the culture and stuff. Are we really doing good things for mental health, or is that an opportunity for improvement we have as a collective? You know, so guilt can bring some attention to some important matters, whether within us, if the guilt is justified, or just matters out there at large. So guilt is not necessarily an all bad thing, right? Any other thoughts on misconceptions? We've got I've got 3 more that we'll include. We got 2 of the big ones.
I think maybe one might be, and I don't know if this was on your list, but permanence, right? Like you assume
that is,
right?
yeah.
You assume that I am always going to feel this way. And just like physical, mental, emotional pain, right? It drops over time, right? Also does our gratitude, like everything drops over time. And if we don't constantly remind ourselves and that kind of thing, then things slip up, right? Like you could be working out for a long, long time. You don't work out 2 days in a row and you just fall off the wagon and you stop going to the gym, whatever. But in that one, thinking that's a permanent state, you are discounting maturity, future experience, future understanding, facts that could come to light that you didn't know about. So it's definitely not permanent, right? Just
Correct.
I think of things now that I have like regrets of a couple of interactions that I had with people that were not malicious, but just didn't go well. I wouldn't say that I'm racked by guilt, but I regret it. I wish I could, fix it. And so I try to make sure that's never going to happen again. Right. But it's not permanent.
Coupled with that, sometimes people think they need punished for it and they won't, let themselves, grow from it. They kind of think, I just always need to feel bad about this, and aren't able to forgive themselves.
Yes, yeah. So, you have it. Feeling guilty doesn't mean you'll always feel bad about it, and it's possible to work through it, make amends, and move forward. And we're going to get to that piece on how you work through it, make amends, and move forward to process it. Because the key thing is to not wait. If you wait too long, repentant actions may not be effective. After doing bad things for a very long time in your life, if you repent at the end of your life, how much value is it? One of the things with repentance itself is that for many people, it always comes much after the event, proper repentance, and too late to do any good to anyone. So not only is it's not permanent, but we shouldn't wait too long to work with guilt constructively. So that is you nailed it with that one there. All right. So another thing with guilt is people often have the misconception that guilt should be suppressed. So they don't outright say it, but this is what they do with it. If you want to know what people believe, look at what they do. So a lot of people believe in this idea of just suppressing guilt, suppressing it, and bearing it down. So that's one misconception about it. But suppressing it can be unhealthy. Acknowledging it and processing it in a constructive way can lead to growth and improve relationships. The big thing here is this: does guilt go away if we suppress it or deny it? Does it really?
No, it's just, you're just kicking the can down, down the road. If you're not dealing with it, it's going to come back up. You've got to deal with certain things like that. And, it's like anything, right? Our society has become one where we're always going after that next dopamine hit, whether it's social media or drugs or sex or food or alcohol or, whatever it is. We're just getting more and more conditioned in modern society to go after this stuff and suppress whatever, whatever you're feeling I guess, I don't know, a different way to say it than what you're guilty about, right? If you're guilty about not going to the gym or not sticking to your diet, you can go get rewarded by suppressing it with something else. And so if you don't deal with it, like whatever it is, it could be even something like the loss of a parent, or, the breakup of a long-standing relationship, or job loss, or whatever. If you don't deal with it, it's just going to come back. And so I don't know. I think suppression's dangerous. It can be dangerous because that can come back up at inopportune times.
You know what? Not only does it come back, it tends to come back stronger, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And then what happens is you end up feeling so remorseful that you just feel inferior for the rest of your life. And then what happens is it becomes its own kind of torturous prison. Think about fugitives who turn themselves in after years on the run. Why do they do that? Right? It becomes a kind of prison that gets worse over time. And they just seek the peace of mind that comes with doing the right thing. People do realize that kind of denying our responsibility and avoiding doing what is necessary to make a situation right, that it's no way to live, So it's also been said that refusing to work with guilt constructively is a way of holding ourselves back and choosing to sit out this incarnation. John Lawrence, who authored The Light of the Christ Within, said, "You are certainly not contributing anything positive or worthwhile to yourself or anyone else when you allow guilt and shame to overshadow and dominate your life. It's basically like wasting your life to do this," right? But people learn that in time. There's many historical examples where it's like, look, if you suppress it, it's coming back stronger. Like, you cannot hold that thing down forever. So anyone else have any thoughts on that one? We have one more to go through, a misconception about guilt. And that is that guilt is an individual experience. That is a misconception. And the reason for it is this. That might sound confusing, but the reason for it is that guilt is often influenced by external factors such as societal expectations, cultural norms, or family dynamics, right? So other people set up the rules that make you feel guilty, and an example could be this. Maybe you go to a church and you get married, but then the person you're married to is extremely abusive, and you have to divorce them for the safety of yourself and your kids. But then you feel guilty because you made a promise before the church and you're not supposed to divorce and everything else. So now you have this conflict going on, but it was set up through this expectation because of the culture you were exposed to. So, if you grew up in a different part of the world with different influences, the same situation you may not have felt guilty for. You may have felt like, woof, that was a close call. I'm glad I did the right thing and got out of a dangerous situation. And I couldn't have known any better. This side of the person didn't come out at the time till after we were already married. So, I did the best I could. Right? So there are also a lot of manipulators who spread unjustified guilt. People will infect you with guilt in order to control you. So an example could be, let's say you have somebody in your family and they're very emotionally abusive. Well, then you may have, if you take healthy distance from them, you may have other family members guilt you that you're betraying the family and you're the problem, really. And, you need to accept all of this mistreatment and everything else. And they may just pile guilt on you, could be an example. Or in cases of abuse, like a lot of times you'll see cases of abuse when there's a history of abuse in a family and they start guilting the victims. So you see that kind of stuff. So that's definitely influence from and saying, oh, you're tearing the family apart and the whole situation was your fault, right? And then sometimes people who are doing wrong things will say, well, if you love me, you will forgive this and everything else. And they'll guilt you and and to let themselves off the hook for some wrongdoing. So people use guilt to solicit you into enabling wrong actions or evil. And I was talking to somebody who broke up with somebody who was very abusive. And that person's parents called the person up who did the breaking up and guilted them for breaking up with their kid. Even though their kid is on crazy drugs and is abusive and is a loose cannon. It's like, hold on. You're an adult and your parents are calling your ex to guilt your ex about breaking up. And you're very aware of all the issues, right? So you don't want to open that door to the people who use guilt to manipulate.
No, and that's super common too, though, right? I mean, you see it all the time of people will do that. My parents left Northern California in 1994 and moved to Utah. And last year at my cousin's funeral back in California, my aunt is still pissed off that my dad left California and destroyed the family and broke everything apart, even though my dad and his siblings were all adults. They were all married. They all had kids, right? This wasn't some, you were my older sibling, protected me from a physically abusive father, and you ran away and left me to, take all the abuse kind of thing. This is like adults following their path, doing what they think they need to do for their family. And my aunt is so pissed off. Like, she's not just, she's pissed off. She is so mad and blames my dad for doing something that benefited all of his kids, that helped them get out of just a deteriorating situation in California. And it's like, my dad, a lot of his siblings, they don't even talk over this thing. Like, some of them will not even talk to each other over this and other perceived things that happened. And so you see this trying to guilt people all the time. And the problem is, it takes a strong person to stand up and say, why don't you go piss up a rope? I'm not going back to your piece of crap son, whatever. Like it does, it takes a strong person to stand against that. And a lot of times you will get, women that have been treated a certain way so that they expect that, or they think that's normal, or they think that, being abused and controlled and all of these. My cousin did the same thing, got beat the crap out of her all the time and knocked off a 7-Eleven, went to prison, and she left him and all that, but then she went back to him.
Yeah.
After now she's totally solid, but it takes a strong person.
Empaths get pulled into it. Empaths get easily manipulated with this. So anyone who's watching and you're an empath, it's beware of being manipulated through guilt, because people try to pull at your emotional heartstrings in ways that are bad intentioned. That's the way the evil forces can get to you, right? And this reminds me of a quote I just threw in there from Tucker Max. It's, when someone guilts me, they imply that I'm responsible for their emotions. For example, if you cared about me, you'd stop making me feel bad. Anyone that tries to make me responsible for their life or their emotions is toxic. I know, because I used to do that. End quote. Absolutely. All right. Why don't we talk about how to work with guilt constructively? Okay. Here's how to work with it constructively. Number one, step one, identify, is guilt relevant in your life right now? And if yes, are you willing to go there? Why are you feeling guilty? Right? What's the story you're telling yourself that leads to guilt? Is this story the undeniable truth, or is it possible you're misinterpreting things somehow? What standard or rule for living did you break? It's if somebody's toxic, you're not allowed to break up with them. That's the rule? Who made up that rule? Oh, the person's parents did? What? What is this mess, right? This is such a drama, right? Or, if somebody's being like emotionally abusive, you're supposed to just put up with it because they're their family or whatever. And you're supposed to stay in an abusive family because it's family, and it's like, what? Who made that rule? Like, another thing you might ask is, how did you disappoint yourself and not live up to your own expectations for yourself? Now, maybe sometimes the guilt is justified. Maybe you broke a promise and you think, I should keep my promises. Well, yes. Okay. Well, maybe that's appropriate. Now we can talk about what to do about it. Right. But the main thing is we just want to check to make sure you haven't given yourself unfair, unrealistic, or misguided rules to live up to, especially other people's rules that are very self-serving for them. That's how guilt is used to manipulate. So that's step one. Step two is to learn from it. Reflect on the situation that caused your guilt and consider what can you learn from it. What's the value behind the guilt? How is it a teacher? How is it a catalyst for your improvement? How can it support your own highest good eventually? Right? So guilt can be an unbelievable gift in disguise if you use it to make better decisions for the future. Because our mistakes can prod us to ultimate victory when the guilt is justified. It can teach us instead of punishing us if we let it. It's going to do one of the two. You can let it punish you forever, or you can let it teach you. Right? But you don't want to resist the life lessons it's trying to deliver to you. Right? So basically, I say, there's two types of guilt, justified and unjustified. So let's walk through some examples to break it down, okay? Here's a guilt story saying, I shouldn't have said and done those things. I should have known better. My actions created pain for other people. So that's what somebody might say. Okay, I shouldn't have said and done those things. I should have known better. My actions created pain for other people. All right. So it sounds like in this case, is this justified or unjustified guilt?
Sounds justified.
Yeah, sounds justified. You created pain for other people. You should feel guilty. Okay. Yeah. Now, why is it a bad idea to think this way, though? To say I shouldn't have done it, I should have known better. Why is it a bad idea to think that way?
Well, you don't give yourself grace to make mistakes, right? Are you neglecting or discounting that you were extremely tired or fatigued or stressed or tired? Were you perfectly good emotionally, physically? Was everything good around you and you acted this way to hurt somebody? Or did you snap because you were under a tremendous amount of stress and you let weakness, guide your tongue? There's a lot of different things that could be going on, right? I mean, that's one of the things that, Delana and I, after all these years, have gotten pretty good at understanding. Is that Steve talking? Is that Delana talking? Is that stress? Is that pain? Is that fatigue? Is it hormones? Like who's talking right then? So if you are 100% solid, great equilibrium, and you're just being a tool, then yeah, whatever. If you are in some emotionally type charged situation, then you can use that to go, okay, next time I'm going to pause before I snap and whatever. So you can use it, you can learn from it, you can adjust your behavior. But are you being selfish and manipulative, or are you under duress? I guess I would say.
Yeah, perfect.
Also judging it after the fact. And so maybe you think I should have known better, but maybe in that moment you really didn't. You only know better now that you're looking back and seeing the situation.
And the truth is, and I love your angle on it, the truth is, if you knew better, you would have done better. Maybe you had an idea to act better, but you didn't really know it as much as you knew to do the wrong thing. You still believed in the wrong thing mostly. So you truly didn't know better, or you would have done better. People are generally doing the best they can with what they know, right? And making mistakes is a natural part of being human. and self-realizing. A lot of times people get this guilt, believe it or not, when they have a high ego.
Just gonna say, it sounds like an ego conflict when Charmaine said it there.
Who are you to think that the whole world is out there and all of us are making mistakes and you're the one exception, the one person who shouldn't be making mistakes? What makes you think you're so superior to the rest of us who say and do dumb things?
You had foresight, you would have decided better.
Like, you should have known better. Like, you're not supposed to make mistakes because you're some superior human compared to the rest of it. It's actually very much ego. People are big guilt because they think that they're supposed to be way better than everyone else. It's like, we all do this or make mistakes, right? So,
But who says I am wrong in this particular situation? Maybe I'm standing up for myself correctly, and you're trying to sell me a bad bill of goods.
true. It's circumstantial. In some situations, you standing up for yourself is not really something we should feel guilty for.
And if you remember when we talk about the drama triangle, the persecutor will do everything they can to convince you you're doing the wrong thing, even though it might be the right thing.
Yes. Yeah. So I'd say in this case, we would say with this, that's good discernment. That's good discernment. Have I just been gaslit into believing I said and did the wrong things when in truth I didn't? I'm just, people are trying to convince me I'm crazy and that I said and did all this. That could be one possibility.
So you have to sell yourself on what you did, and if you're standing up for yourself in the right way, and then you can always take a look at it back a day later or 2 days later and say, well, maybe that wasn't the right thing. Maybe I didn't take this into consideration. But if you're not having those thoughts or feelings, you feel like, yeah, I did stand up for myself, and yeah, this feels uncomfortable, but maybe I'm doing the right thing, and maybe I just haven't had enough practice at doing the right thing.
Yeah.
So there is no guilt for it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And then I think, as far as an empowering truth, if we want to create like a new story here, it could be like, I can gain clarity on how to make right my wrongs or fix what I've broken and make a sincere effort to make amends. And in future, I will pause and think before I act, as Steve had alluded, right? Or you could say, I did the best I could at the time, and now that I know better, I can do better in future. Essentially, like a good idea at the time to act and to say and do these mean things in this situation.
But I think it's also how you present yourself is also part of that. So you might feel guilty in how you presented yourself or how the conversation went. But if you're confident in your stance, you tend to present yourself more as calm and centered than as rageful.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you have to look at what your emotional level is at that time when you're having this conflict. Are you speaking like a statesman, like an orator, or are you speaking from anger and emotion? And you know what those two different feelings.
Yep.
And is the other person responding in the same way? Are they responding as an orator, or are they responding out of their anger and persecution?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it all comes down to this. We just need to learn to behave. That's it. Pay attention and learn to behave, in summary.
Pay attention to the details.
Yeah. Let's go on to a new one. I'm going to throw a new one into the chat and describe it. Guilt story number 2. I was unkind to someone in the past and there's no way to make it better with them. Perhaps they are dead or gone. That might be a guilt story. And I've coached people through this one with people who are now deceased and your last interaction with them was really not good and now they're dead and gone. Right? So my first question is, why is it a bad idea to think this way? Right? We want to first get leverage. It's a bad idea to indulge in this guilt story. Why is it a bad idea to think this way?
You can't fix that specific circumstance.
Yes. So now this is just endless self-punishment. Why else is it a bad idea to think this way, Joel?
Charmaine kind of took mine. Like, there's no redemption. You're just gonna live in that state.
Yeah, whatever has been done can't be undone. We're beating ourselves up for nothing.
Well, it doesn't leave room for growth or for healing.
Yeah. So
I think A more interesting question would be, why are you beating yourself up over a situation you can't fix? What are you getting out of this?
Yeah, and that's going to be ego again, that there's something so special about us that we shouldn't screw up and make regrettable mistakes like everyone else out there. Like, it's like, no, this is part of the unlearned lesson.
Yeah.
Right?
It
And
also give
so-
people a reason not to try in the future.
Yes. That's a good one too.
Well, I think, you know, I don't know. I kind of look at this like when we are unshackled from the physicality of our current existence, right? When we have died, when our spirit has moved on, all the things of this existence right now are not going to trouble us anymore. We're not going to feel pain. We're not going to be worried about time. We're not going to have the stresses that we have right now. And I really feel like that person that maybe you had an argument, maybe they had a big part in this too, right? Maybe it just wasn't you, that you were both going back and forth, that they probably maybe have some type of regret, but have let it go, that it doesn't matter anymore. It matters to us maybe because we're still here on this plane or whatever, but it doesn't have to drag us down like this, because you can flip that and say, you know what? I want to make sure that my last interaction with everybody is positive, right? When people walk out the door, they know how I feel about them. When I talk to my parents, when I talk to my kids, I always end the call, let them know I love them, right? In case that's the last one. I want it to be a positive interaction. Or I could just do nothing and go like Charmaine and Joel said, well, screw it, you know, whatever. And so you can definitely pivot off of that one. That's a great one to pivot off.
Yes.
But I really don't think you may have that. And that's this human frailty that we have to get past. But we need to get past it because it doesn't, I really don't think it matters on the other side to that party anymore. And so it shouldn't matter to us.
Yeah, I would say in this case, you kind of nailed a really good aspect. And what's happening right here is guilt. Think of guilt like a teacher. The teaching, there's the lesson guilt is trying to give you that we haven't got yet. And you've basically unpacked it in that we can use this experience to give the guilt a worthy purpose by using it and the experience of it to resolve to do better in future. Decide to treat everybody in a positive way as if it might be your last interaction with them. Once you engage that lesson, that guilt has served its purpose in teaching you here. The other thing is, if there's no way to make it better with them, you can neutralize it by doing an equally proportionate, an equally significant act of kindness to someone else in the present.
Pay it forward.
There you go. There you go.
One other thing here, though, you are making a decision as to how you think that other person feels about it. You don't know how they've interpreted it. In fact, a lot of times people can understand why you might have done something and have already forgiven you. You just don't even know about it.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. So there's some assumptions going on here too. It's not the undeniable truth that it was that significant to them as well. Coots.
Charmaine had just said it there. Well, this person's not giving them permission for forgiveness in any way, right? Instead, they're just basking in what they think was bad, and obviously this person is gone. So if they went over some sort of, you know, nifty forgiveness protocol, maybe they could learn a few things about how they can forgive themselves for the act and learn from it. And even though this person's dead and gone, get to that assumption that maybe they can forgive them for something that was probably perceived as small in comparison. But yeah, I think this person would be lacking in forgiveness for themselves and from the other person.
Yeah.
I love Charmaine's idea where we fill in a lot of the gaps with our own frog DNA. So So we just kind of make up our own storyline to kind of match how we want to feel. And Charmaine's right. That person may totally have a totally different take, totally different emotion, totally different level of forgiveness that we could not even perceive. So we continue with the same storyline that we feel comfortable with, comfortable feeling that guilt, comfortable feeling that pain. But Charmaine's absolutely right. That person can have a totally different storyline, a totally different take that you're not able to use to move yourself forward because you're not giving yourself the opportunity to consider the fact that that person might have felt or said something differently than what you could have thought of.
Yep.
Friend of mine likes to tell me, like, you know how they have the saying, you can walk a mile in someone else's shoes? You may be in their shoes, but we have a really hard time being that person. Usually we're still ourselves, but we put ourselves in their shoes and what we would do in that situation. That's not what that person, may do. So it's the same kind of idea here. We're thinking they'll feel horrible about this because of X, Y, and Z. And really, you don't know what it's like to be them in that situation.
Yep. All right. Absolutely. Shall we go on to another one here? So these are common ones. Now the next one is kind of similar to what Chris was alluding to. Guilt story number 3 is basically this. Feeling guilty, I stood up for myself and it didn't land well with the other person. This is an empath guilt story. Obviously, a lot of empaths feel this way when they finally set a boundary. The other person lashes out and it doesn't go over well. Now they feel guilty, like, oh no, now they're over there and they're over drinking and doing all these bad things, and I shouldn't have done what I did, So anyway, guilt story.
Cushion stacks even more guilt.
Yeah, exactly. Feeling guilty for standing up for ourselves is guilt story number 3. Now, why is it a bad idea to think this way? What are your thoughts?
You will sell
Well,
yourself
man.
out every time. You will always let them get away with it. You'll always allow yourself to take the weaker position. And you think that you're doing the right thing, taking the weaker position. But they want you to do that. And the
Yeah.
problem is, you need to start standing up for yourself and start identifying things for yourself independently and individually. As I said, if you feel like you're an orator, you're in the right spot. If you feel like you're acting through emotion, you may want to re-examine. But you need to practice it. You need to practice standing up for yourself and understanding it when those other people lash out. That is also practice. That is practice in the arena. That is practice fighting. That is practice standing up yourself in conflict, experiencing the feelings of conflict, uncertainty, doubt, guilt, hate, anger at yourself for doing this for years upon years. You no longer have to do it. Feel the pain, work through it, and be a stronger man for it. Stop sitting on your ass and stop taking it. I will find you otherwise.
Sounds like you're drinking the Kool-Aid, Chris.
Sounds like I'm drinking my own Kool-Aid. That's for damn sure.
High fives.
Somewhere needed to hear Chris's message. That's all I got to say. That was good, Chris. That was excellent.
Well, and we're not responsible for the way other people react to stuff, right? Everyone's got their own free will. And, I mean, you even see, right? I mean, kids that grow up in the same household react differently to everything that happens, right? You've got, one kid that's a spoiled brat. You've got one kid that's grateful. You've got one, person that's lazy. One, you get all kinds of crap, but, you cannot just keep being a whipping boy or girl or whatever, but you can't just sit there and take the abuse because someone else reacts badly to something. My mother-in-law did everything for my father-in-law. Made all his food, did everything, right? And he came to expect it, and he was quite rude when it wasn't done up, to his expectation of, you didn't make my sandwich like this. And then he had a stroke and things got much, much worse. And I'm honestly surprised she didn't smother him with a pillow. I thought she would. And, he died of Alzheimer's last year. but there was finally some forgiveness that came out of all that. But she allowed, you know, she made some comment like she worshiped the ground he walked on, and then he walked all over her. And so she never stood up for herself. And, you know, and I think she regrets that and says, you know, I should have, you know, life would have been better, would have had a partnership, maybe a more fulfilling relationship, that kind of thing. But, you know, especially if you're an empath and you're feeling that more deeply than other people do, you are more easily swayed by these types of things. And that is something, you know, if someone's like that, you've got to be cognizant of that, because if you're not careful, that's not going to end well for you. It just doesn't. You tend to fold in a lot of those situations.
You're right. If we go along with that story, we tend to become enablers of wrong behavior because we're valuing the wrong thing. We're valuing feeling. Oh, if it doesn't feel good, it's not good. When we should be valuing principles. Sometimes it's uncomfortable to do the right thing. So it's a value misalignment. We need to value doing what is right versus doing what feels right for everyone involved, right? So, and that's maturity. When empaths develop, in particular, they develop that maturity, and they really come into their own when they learn these lessons, right? These lessons don't come easy in the beginning, for sure. So a lot of people make these mistakes. But yeah, you're right. I mean, we can't always predict and control how our good intentions will be received. Anyone else have any thoughts they wanted to add to that one before we talk about
to add on to Steve? I think Steve made a really great point. And also, if you think, I saw a meme on Facebook about fight, flight, freeze, or fawn as the fourth item. Fawning is when you are over accommodating to someone who is threatening to you. So you're trying to say, please don't hurt me. I'll do whatever you want, and go out of your way to do it. But that is a way of protecting yourself. But also, again, that leaves you open to where you receive this abuse, but really you think it's a strategy to protect yourself, but really it's allowing a lot of abuse to occur. And it's such a trade-off strategy in a lot of ways. You're allowing you're doing it to keep the peace. Serve that other person because you think that's the right thing, because that's how you'll justify it to yourself. But really, you're allowing yourself to be abused. So fawning is like one of those fight or flight techniques, and I really like that meme pulling that aspect out, the fawning aspect.
Yep. Yeah. Another thing too, sometimes people feel guilty that other people have a bad impression of them now. Oh, you're just like everybody else. I thought you were different and you made me feel bad about myself and blah, blah, blah. And then they feel guilty. But another thing I remind people of is, confused people will come up with all kinds of confused ideas about you, but who you are before the creator, higher power, or God is all that matters. All right, let's go on to number 4, guilt story number 4. It's this. I chose to be with the person I'm with, whether it's a spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, but now I can't leave them or break up with them because if I did, they would be so lost. All right. So that's guilt story number 4. I chose to be in a relationship with this person, but I can't break up with them now. They'll be so lost without me. All right. Any thoughts on why it's a bad idea to think this way? Charmaine, how about you? Why is it a bad idea to think this way?
Going back to the Messiah complex.
Yes.
It's not exactly what happened with me, but I will say, I got divorced at the, right at the beginning of the pandemic. And my ex-husband certainly thought I was a horrible person to kick him out when he couldn't support himself and kick him out when there's a pandemic going on. There certainly was an effort to manipulate me.
Yeah. I think with this one too, in addition to the Messiah complex, we're affirming the limitations of the other individual rather than affirming their higher potential. Human beings are incredibly resilient when put to the test. the fact we feel they would be lost without us probably highlights a fundamental reason why this relationship isn't working, because we're so focused on what's wrong with them that we can't even see what's right with them, or we would realize how well they could find a way through hard times on their own, as every human has. Everybody's always found a way through hard times because they're still here, right?
We need hard times to grow, right? If you don't have those hard times, you're not challenged to expand and grow and develop personally. So I think sometimes we become like a safety net for other people. And because we're that safety net and they know that you're there, they aren't having to challenge themselves and do more. And so it kind of goes back to what Steve was saying and about being an enabler. And the more you do things for other people, you're almost training them to expect that and to be lazy and to not challenge themselves.
Yeah. So another way of saying that too is these people will become very fragile because we're treating them fragile. And that's not good for the relationship either, because now it's like, oh my goodness, now I'm with a spiritual cream puff. Like,
Well, you've seen that with the way a lot of parents raise their kids over the last 20 years, right? If I remove all accountability, all responsibility, you don't have any chores, you don't fight your own battles, you don't learn to communicate with adults, like our kids at times would be like, hey, we get your report card. Why do you have a 0? Well, I turned it in and the teacher didn't do it. Well, go talk to them. What, like, are you just for real? Like, go talk to your teacher about this and get this resolved. Don't take a 0 because you said it was done and that's it. But there's so many people where parents have sheltered and coddled them to the point that they cannot do hard things. They can't. And so and I'm overgeneralizing, I know that, but when you look at relationships and this guilt story number 4, part of the reason of dating, courting, all that kind of thing is to find an individual that you are equally yoked with, right? That is how you build a lasting relationship. The spark, the common interest, the whatever, all that crap wears off. And sure, people change, people do stupid things, mental health, drugs, alcohol, idiocy, they were hiding things, all that. I get all that. But, when you look at things, if you are not equally yoked with your partner, unless you can make that happen, in my opinion, you do not have a long-term relationship that is going to last. And you could put this off, but it's still not going to end well.
But it's not just the relationship. It's like you were talking about with your kids. You're not helping them be, good human beings, essentially. I mean, I brought up that song a long time ago, I Wish You Pain. It's that kind of thing. You want them to suffer through those challenges so they do learn and they're able to take care of themselves. You want to build a great human being, not just have someone that you've coddled and taken care of and they're lost without you. Ideally, you want them to thrive.
Yeah.
One of my favorite Canadian once said, pain can be a great teacher.
Who was
I
that?
heard that favorite Canadian part.
Dion. Or Justin Bieber said that.
Justin Bieber.
I was going back to Bryan Adams for a second, trying to think what song was that.
Yeah. So with this one, really, people are more capable than we may think. If we're not meant to be with them, they're not our assignment. The love and wisdom of the universe will take care of them as it always has.
Would this be an example of someone stuck in a rescuer state?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. With a victim.
Yes. Okay.
Right? We want to go, and when we talked about drama triangle, when we enable, we disable.
Gotcha. Yeah.
What happens is we just start disabling this person we're in a relationship even further and further by enabling them. And we need to learn to empower, not enable. Help them, give them the space or the encouragement to learn how to solve their own challenges in their own way. And sometimes that suffering is the very medicine that they need to heal. It helps purify them. It's good for them to experience some consequences of their actions so they can be better. This is what they need. The suffering they might experience is the medicine they need to change their ways. You know, so it can truly be the most loving thing to do, is let people suffer. Right? So let's go into one more guilt story. This one's a heavy one. Okay. It's this. I am guilty of committing an abortion, which was unkind to do to the soul of the unborn child. Okay. This is guilt story number 6. We're skipping 5. I'm guilty of committing an abortion, which is unkind to do the soul of the unborn child. Okay, why is it a bad idea to think this way?
I'll go back and change it.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, you already made the decision, right? So,
you know, you're right. On the surface, it might seem like a selfish thing to have done. On the surface, who knows across all space and time the truth of what is best for all involved? A lot of spiritual masters say that sometimes a soul takes on the body of a baby that is fated for abortion so that they may purify that last bit of karma before being liberated. Sometimes a soul takes on the body of a baby fated for abortion so they may purify that last bit of karma. Right? So, something to think about. Now, the other thing I would say is Dr. Brian Weiss, he wrote the book Only Love is Real. He's a reincarnation expert. And, you know, his advice in a situation like this is that you can never harm or kill a soul. The soul is immortal and indestructible. It will find a way to return if that is the plan. And he said he has case studies where the same soul, after a miscarriage or abortion, comes back to the same parents as their next baby. So this is this is getting into more advanced perspectives. What are the spiritual masters saying? What's the reincarnation experts saying? But the main thing here is this. It comes down to the person who did this did the best they could at the time with what they knew. And we certainly want them to be at their best so they can do better at future. So it's important for them to find some sort of peace in what has occurred, you know, so that they can move forward as best as possible. So that one's an intense one, but that's where guilt can go sometimes, right? Because it's like, how else are we going to get out of this one? Like, yikes. Okay. So, anyone else have any thoughts about that one? So let's go back.
I think one thing is a lot of times, I think that's not necessarily the right example, but there are things beyond your control. And I mean, in a sense, that could have been something beyond your control if it was like a circumstance where you didn't feel like you could raise a kid responsibly in a certain scenario that you're in. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times you just have to be kind to yourself and realize that a lot of times people do the best they can at the point that they're at. And just know that, like you're saying, there's a bigger thing in play in the universe. I'm not to use that as a crutch again and again, but it doesn't help to just dwell in something as though I feel like choices always push us eventually in the right direction. Even if we keep making the wrong ones.
And I think in this situation, we don't want to get caught up in the right or wrongs of the action. We want to get caught up in seeing the innocence of the person who is being punished by their guilt. I think that is the right thing to do in this situation, because this situation cannot be reversed. So let's help you see your innocence and help you see something good in the grand scheme of things across all space or time that might have been unfolding in this situation that may have been beneficial, or that this situation may not even be done yet because this soul may return to you and fulfill whatever was fated to happen between you. So I think that's where we want to get into. That's where we want to work with it constructively. And then, the next step would be to commit to overcoming, letting go of the guilt. So we kind of talked about identify if you have a guilt thing going on, to practice discernment. So this was step 2. All these stories are just using discernment. 3 is to commit to it. Like, what is the guilt blocking you from? What do you need to let go of? What is the top value or priority you need to keep? How can you make sure you don't break this rule again in future? If you did break a rule that feels like an appropriate rule, how can you commit to a life without guilt? Because it can be an incredible waste of time. So we want to commit to it. And then number 4 is turn your guilt into action. Feeling guilty is not the same thing as doing something about it. A lot of people, because guilt is hard, people feel like they are doing something about it. It's like, oh, don't talk about that. I already feel guilty about it. It's like, hold on, you haven't actually done anything with it. We want to think, how can you make positive changes in your behavior? What are you willing to do to create a solution and handle this right now? How might you take responsibility? In German, the word for guilt is debt. So there is a sense of indebtedness. We should figure out why and figure out what we can do. And like I said, in some cases where you can't repay it, do an act of kindness to somebody else and say, hey, because I did that wrong thing before to somebody else, I am doing this incredibly nice, thoughtful thing to a stranger and blessing them. So I turn my guilt into a blessing for a random stranger. At the very least, we can do that if you can't make it right with the person that you committed a wrong with. Right? So sometimes you can't make amends for whatever reason. So, and then just step 5 would be rehearse. If you were in the same situation today, how might you handle it better? Kind of play it out in your mind. See how you might deal with the same situation in a way that is consistent with the standards you're committed to. Visualize it. See, hear, and feel yourself handling the situation. Just kind of rehearse it. Okay, if somebody gets you triggered, play it out in your mind. How are you going to handle it? Are you going to stop and think before you speak or act? Or are you just going to be impulsive and let your emotions have their way with you, right? So it's rehearse the situation. And then remember this, it's if you always do your best, there's no way you can judge yourself. If you always do your best, there's no way you can judge yourself. And if you don't judge yourself, how can there be guilt? So just always make an effort to do your best to avoid letting guilt creep in. And then a quote I have from Peace Pilgrim that I want to share with everybody. Peace Pilgrim, as you know, is one of my heroes, right? From her book, Her Life and Work in Her Own Words, she says, you must learn to forgive yourself as easily as you forgive others, and then take a further step and use all that energy that you used in condemning yourself for improving yourself. Take all that energy you were using with guilt and punishing yourself and use it to improve yourself. That's how you can work with it constructively. So let's go into final thoughts, key takeaways about guilt and tonight's conversation. Steve, why don't we start with you?
No, I think I liked putting out those, misconceptions, naming them, putting a label on it, I guess, for lack of a better expression, just to kind of understand how to operate within those, right? It's kind of just learn kind of what the system is, so you know how to work with it and not be a slave to it, like you had said earlier, not be imprisoned by it, but be able to pivot and move on from it. And so that was, I always love these because I feel like they really conceptualize or verbalize things in a way that I don't necessarily have thought of. And so those 5 are just good takeaways to remember, those that, especially the permanence, I think that's so important. Just remembering that, this is not a permanent thing, and this too shall pass, just like every other good and bad thing. So Yeah, great session. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a fun conversation. Chris, how about yourself? Final thoughts, key takeaways.
Well, I love Steve's idea of things are permanent, but not permanent, but only if you let it be permanent. Only if you continue to run that same story of guilt, to continue to express that guilt to yourself, which means you really haven't gained closure on that situation. And there are different strategies to start getting closure on things. And I think that's one thing people who feel guilty about is they need some sort of closure with something related to what they're feeling about. And once you have that, sometimes that closure sometimes that closure is the necessary to push forward, to find that next relationship, to find that next house you're going to live in, to move on from where you're stuck from, to having that adventure. That will buy you all that extra energy that guilt is absorbing. That guilt wants to be felt, wants to be acknowledged, but you also can acknowledge it by moving forward. That guilt doesn't want to keep you. That guilt wants you to move forward in your life, to build, to become. The person who you are angry at or feel guilty towards, that person wants you to move on with your life, build, push forward. Even with their own anger, that is their pain that they're expressing to you. But they're expressing to you a wish for you to get on with your life, to move forward by any means necessary, whether you crawl, walk, or run. That guilt, that person's wish for you is to push forward, to find a way to grow, find a way to stop feeling guilty, but to start feeling life again instead. You can do it. One step at a time, one crawl at a time. You don't need a big breakthrough. You just need to do it daily. Tell yourself a new story daily.
Love it. Powerful words. Powerful words. Cootsie Patootsy, final thoughts, key takeaways.
I for some reason just went back to a saying I like where guilt is like a rocking chair, gives you something to do and gets you nowhere. So that one kind of sticks with me. You can also say worrying. Worrying gives you something to do, gets you nowhere. I also throughout the conversation kept reminding myself that guilt is not constructive in any way, right? So when we tend to fall into guilty cycles, it does nothing. There's no constructive aspect to it. Instead, like you've mentioned there, do something about it. Make it better in some way. How can you be better? As well as guilt can cripple you, and you need to find a way to move from the past.
Yeah, work with it constructively instead of letting it immobilize and punish us. Absolutely. Guilt is like a rocking chair, gives you something to do, but gets you nowhere. Love it. Cootsie Patootsy. All right. Joel, final thoughts, key takeaways.
A lot of it's already been said, but I just a reminder that the only time guilt doesn't serve us is if we live there and we don't want to grow or improve. It can be a crutch, it can feel comfortable. It can, in a, indirect way, bring a significance of, feeling this heavy burden for ourselves and in need of, almost attention or, this need of forgiveness without actually doing anything about it to procure it. So yeah, kind of like has been expressed. I think for me, the takeaway is just to, do the hard work, and sometimes what seems like hard work actually gives you the most freedom and gives you the most peace, just to forgive yourself. I mean, how many of us, would treat others, way more kindly than we would treat ourselves, or be way more, easy on others than we'd be on ourselves? We have to be nice to ourselves too. We have to give ourselves grace too, to make mistakes and to, to learn from them and to understand that it's a process. It's a human process. Like, we've all made mistakes. We've all done things that we regret. So yeah, as long as you use that as grist, as, you know, fodder to do better, then it's all learning in the right direction.
Perfect, very nice. And I love what you're saying, but it's basically what you're saying is guilt will punish us until we turn it into constructive action. And that constructive action, it might be making amends somehow, but it might be also seeing our own innocence might be the constructive action. You know, having greater self-compassion for the fact that we are imperfect humans, making mistakes as we learn how to live a human life more virtuously. You know, and guilt is our teacher in that process, because guilt makes it uncomfortable to avoid learning our lessons. It happens for us, right? So it makes it uncomfortable to resist our own personal evolution. Like, definitely, it's always, I think guilt can be fierce grace.
That was a great question. What if life is always happening for us? And
Yeah,
every step along the way is just part of the journey, as long as we learn from it.
exactly. I believe it is. Charmaine, final thoughts today.
I think it's interesting that a lot of us kind of focused on the same idea, but each of us kind of peeled it out a little bit differently. And
Yep.
so sometimes I think we get triggered by different people saying things a different way. And towards the end, you said something about how sometimes, you know, people say something to us and we're like, oh, you don't have to say that. I feel guilty enough already. And I do think we take that on and we think our feeling guilty is somehow, you know, the remedy, or somehow, you know, what we're due or what we need to do in order to make something better. And really, that feeling of guilt is not really the goal. We shouldn't be wallowing in it. You know, it should propel us to self-examination and then maybe to action. You know, it depends, but we need to reflect on it, not wallow in it. And the goal isn't for us to feel bad. So I think that idea kind of pulled it together for me. And the other thing that really stood out for me tonight is Steve was saying something about him and his wife saying, oh, who's really speaking? Is it Steve? You know, is it, you know, fatigue? You know, and that idea. And I think if you keep that in mind, it gives you more grace with other people and more grace about a situation. And sometimes I think we feel guilt because we weren't at our best. But if we're able to create this environment where we understand we're not always at our best, and we know other people kind of can come at that same approach, it gives us a little more freedom to not react so strongly to what happened, to give ourselves grace and more room to grow. Because if we're so caught in the negative feelings, we're not focusing on how we can grow and be better.
I think well, first of all, that is a beautiful frog. Damn, I love frogs. Did you catch that with the open hand method?
That was my daughter.
Oh, nice. I love it.
Hand method.
I love it. Charmaine, you did a 10 out of 10 job summarizing the entire call. My goodness. That was incredible.
I'm just reflecting back what we all brought to the table, right?
Well, and you are a mirror that is reflecting in the best way possible, if that's the case, because I feel like you know that's really what it comes down to. Feeling guilty is not the solution. It's not what we should be settling on. As Coots said, it's like a rocking chair that, you know, gives us something to do, but we're not going anywhere. We need to, you know, and we use it as an excuse to let ourselves off the hook. Oh, I don't have to. I already feel guilty about that. Right. And that's definitely one of the big aspects of working through this. All right, everybody. Excellent job out there tonight. And also, thanks to all of you for having this conversation that we might share with other people in future, as this is a gift to suffering humanity and people who might be looking for correctives of perspectives, specifically on guilt. And that's why we do this, just because we care about strangers or anyone else who might watch this conversation, because we are all in this together. So that being said, count of 3, we go friends forever, fist bump, group hug, we're out. Okay, everybody ready? Chris, you better do this, even though I know your camera's not on.
You can hear me.
There we go. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
Friends forever.
Friends forever.
And enemies forever.
Woo! Yeah!
Group hug.
Love you
Right.
guys.
Have a good week.
Bye, guys. Good combo.